Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This project has received funding from the European Union and Carleton University. The views expressed in this video do not reflect those of the European Union or the Center for European Studies.
So what I want to talk about are three or four areas that are, to my mind, the critical ones when one wants to talk about a strategic partnership between Canada and the European Union. So first of all, security and defense. When the seminar on ESDP took place, the one that's going to take place again, that was mentioned by Manfred earlier on, when it took place last year, one of the striking things was the Canadian official, not so much the officials, but the parliamentarians that came, wanted to talk about NATO. Wanted to talk about NATO, NATO, NATO. And on the one hand, one could say that Canadian interests in terms of Canada-EU relations are totally overshadowed by that. At the same time, there is actually one of those agreements, one of the ones that I mentioned in conversation earlier on, one of those narrow agreements where Canada agrees to participate in common security and defense policy missions. And again, as was preempted earlier on, this has indeed happened. In Palestine, previously in Afghanistan, I think presently Kosovo, and shortly to be Ukraine. So I want to say something about ESDP, because on the one hand, this cooperation, you can count them, and those sound really big, right? Palestine, Kosovo, Ukraine. On the other hand, it's a policeman over here, it's a policeman over there. That is to say, Canada's participation, it's part of this symbolic politics, where Canada, yes, participates, but it's 2 policemen, 5 policemen, 10 policemen on police missions. It's a small contribution, you might say. Critics have said it doesn't actually mean much in terms of the relationship, doesn't actually contribute to the strategic relationship, doesn't really do what NATO does it? Now, I'm going to suggest there's a point to that critique, but the mention of Ukraine earlier on, I think, gives the lie to the essential irrelevance of Canada's participation in ESDP. NATO can't do Ukraine. I mean, it can kind of do something related to it in the region, but it can't do Ukraine. It's pretty much agreed that something needs to be done from the Western side about Ukraine. There's a variety of things that can be done on the sanctions side and so on. What the ESDP can do is the sorts of things that was just mentioned, and we'll see how effective that is. Now, you and I can say, is that enough? Is it not enough? What's really interesting about Canadian participation, if Canada could participate, if Canada can participate, is it's one of those things that actually indicates symbolically that Canada is engaged, Canada is concerned, Canada is actually willing to do something other than tread loudly and carry a small stick. So let me say, I think in that context, the ESDP and Canada cooperation is important. Energy and the environment. The EU has an energy union recently announced. Much has been promised. We will see. There's a Canada-EU energy dialogue, much touted, now revitalized. We will see. To my mind, what's interesting about the strategic element of energy is, until recently, people would kind of ignore price. People still ignore infrastructure. Infrastructure, by the way, that in terms of environment, has implications not too far from here, okay? All of this to say that price and infrastructure, and then there's other purchasers, right? There's other players here. There's the big oil companies. There's the other directions that the oil can go. All of this to say that the Canada-EU relationship on energy and environment is, well, worth watching, but as I say, the dialogue is being revitalized. In the meantime, we are recovering from the spat, let's call it, over the Fuel Quality Directive, where Canadian oil interests were very concerned about the labeling of dirty oil by the European Union. I was going to say something about the Arctic. I'm going to cut that out. I certainly can talk about it after the break, or after in discussion. What's interesting about discussing what caused problems, what was an irritant in the relationship, what are the significant issues, is I can point to energy and environment as being important now, security and defense as being important now. What slowed down the agreement? Was it something to do with this? Was it a big issue that Canada and the European Union don't see eye to eye over? Is it something really significant in terms of global politics? Yeah, human rights are significant in terms of global politics. But one wouldn't imagine that Canada and the EU have a big difference of opinion on human rights. And yet, one of the new bits that gets introduced into the SPA in comparison to some of those old agreements is that the European Union insistence on a human rights clause. There's also a non-proliferation clause, I think, as well. But the one that caught everybody's attention was the human rights clause, right? Now, on the one hand, I'm tempted to say, why such a fuss about what is apparently a dead letter? And what I mean by that is both sides observe human rights. Both sides believe that shared values are to do with democracy and human rights. So why the conflict? And why the insistence on the EU side, and why the reluctance on the Canadian side? Let me suggest to you a variety of reasons why the Canadians might have been reluctant to have a clause on human rights. 2 minutes? Yeah. Sovereignty, that old hobby horse, perhaps, right? I don't buy it, to be honest. I don't think that really was, I mean, people complain about this, don't want to give up right to, but the whole accord compromises sovereignty at one level. SEALs and the European Parliament, again, why would that have to do with human rights? Well, there's this idea that somehow a human rights clause might be invoked by one side, the European side, as a way of getting at Canadian behavior with regard to the North. The Canadian experience not with Europe, but with the Human Rights Committee, where these human rights type of accords are a way that Canada gets beaten over treatment of its native populations. So maybe the Canadians are reluctant. They sign, though. I'm actually going to be interested to see what the negotiated arrangement was, because I haven't actually had a chance to look, but that's the part I really wanted to look at, because that was the part that somehow they worded an agreement. On the EU side, why was the EU so insistent? Why does the EU want to make sure that Canada observes human rights? It doesn't. It's not concerned with Canada observing human rights. It's not thinking that Canadians are committing genocide against its native population, even though some people here believe that to be the case at one level. It's not the point of the agreement. The point of having human rights in there is it's a function of what I would call templatism. There's a tendency of the EU to do what Professor Soroka suggested. Look at the way that they have these agreements. It's now called an SPA, and it's got this list of things. It's a cookie cutter, right? It's a cookie cutter, though, one might argue, because that's how the EU has done it. The EU is this community of law. That's how they behave. And so then there's internal bargaining, and they can't negotiate around that, and so it ends up that way. Templatism is more than that, actually. Templatism is not backwards referenced. It's not what was and the rigidity there. It's an attempt, as I say, normative law in this case, projecting forward. It's the European Union saying, Canada, don't worry, it's not to do with you. We want this in there so that the strategic partnership agreements have that there if we can. Please, our other agreements, we want to have this human rights clause. So it's a template that then gets to be applied elsewhere. It's part of the European Union behaving in a world which is a world of multiple bilateralisms rather than multilateralism. It's a way of sequencing relationships. The strategic partnership agreement, like the previous ones, it's hortatory. To look for, yeah, I'm done, finished now. It's to expect it to be instrumental, to expect it to be regulatory, to expect it to, in a sense, do something, is actually too much. These agreements aren't very long. They set out general things. They're filled out, in fact, in the narrower agreements. They're filled out by future behavior on the part of the parties. And in that context, Canada-EU relations is shaped only in very general terms by an SPA. And I think it's important to recognize that as that normative law, as that speech act, the strategic partnership agreement is part of a wider network, a wider web of relations across the Atlantic. It's only a very small part, a significant part at one level, but one very small part. It's not the key to the relationship. It's just one small element. Thank you.
Now, the EU, it seems to me, many people have spoken on it. Let me offer maybe something a bit different perspective. I think the challenge for the European Union in use of this specific term is to understand the nature of the EU itself and the ongoing experiment of European integration, because it's kind of trying to overcome the challenge of the EU not really being a unitary actor, and that challenge of being strategic at all. And I think that's the area of challenge for the EU, qua EU, because in many areas, of course, of foreign policy, the EU is not competent, does not have competence given to it by its member states. And so how does it act on behalf of all these countries, especially in areas where it's not authorized? So I would argue that actually the primary driver of strategic partnership on the EU side is an internal function, not an external one. The real driver and motivation behind this term, strategic partnership, is a disciplining mechanism on EU member states to try to get a lowest common denominator framework so that they actually speak somewhat from the same page on some basic issues, rather than go off the reservation, as we would say, each saying whatever it wants. Because member states are still conducting their own foreign policies, but if you can have some basic framework and orientation, at least you have some sort of orientation for them. And I think that is much more the motivation. When I was in the Clinton administration, I had to go in to explain to my colleague who was in charge of Russian affairs one day what the EU strategic partnership with Russia meant, because they couldn't make any sense of it. And basically, this is the explanation, that how do you get Poland, Spain, Italy on the same view when it comes to Russia? It is to provide some basic framework in which people agree, okay, we'll do this. But that certainly doesn't constrain individual member states when conducting their own foreign policy toward a country like Russia. And it doesn't also solve issues. You'd see on Ukraine, for instance, the spokesman of the EU is fairly invisible when it comes to trying to solve the Ukrainian crisis. It is member state foreign ministers that have been playing much more of a role, or chancellors, than the so-called representative of the EU. So it's not always the most useful term, but it is more a disciplining device internally rather than a huge issue externally. It's also intended to elevate the EU within the European Union debates about its relative status on the ongoing process of European integration. It is to keep the EU higher up. And in the ongoing battle of authority within the EU, it gives it one more instrument vis-a-vis its own member states and the Commission. So I think one should not underestimate that I believe, is the primary driver. But there are, of course, external elements to that. If you look at the formal strategic partnerships, they are big power oriented. They're not small power oriented. And they're not normative in the sense that one says some normative convergence, as we can see the one with Russia is problematic. So I'm not sure that's guided particularly by that. It's guided by these other motivations. It is a signaling device also externally to other countries of elevation and status and a willingness to deal with them. But it also is a legitimizing function for the EU as an actor legitimized in the international stage to be dealing with these countries, since it is not, in fact, a country. So if you put all that together, the United States and the EU come at this from somewhat different perspectives. And of course, you could argue that of all the countries in the world, all the entities in the world, there is no relationship that is more complex, more multi-layered, more involved in economic, diplomatic, societal, and security relationships than the relationship across the North Atlantic between the United States and the European Union. That's the closest, most complex relationship either has with any other partner anywhere in the world. And that the values, interests, and the economic integration, the human bonds, simply render this a unique partnership beyond any. And it encompasses a very vast range of operational dialogues, task forces, everything David said, institutional exchanges, stakeholder mechanisms, and networks that reach deep into both societies, far beyond this particular term. And so one can say, well, that's the partnership. I think if you go back to the reality of this relationship, though, you see that while the United States works with increasingly with EU institutions, it has seen that neither the Treaty of Lisbon nor any of the recent EU innovations have done much to reduce the EU's institutional complexity, shall we say. And it has not they have not necessarily rendered the EU a unitary actor or even a coherent actor in some areas. And so U.S. policymakers are never going to put bet all the marbles on just dealing with Brussels. They will deal always, of course, with every member state in its capital. At the same time, they work the scene in Brussels, just as, of course, the EU does the same in the United States. In fact, the last place you see a U.S.-EU strategic partnership is in Washington, D.C., because every EU member state is jealously protecting its bilateral relationship with Washington. And it's going to be the last place you're ever going to see a strong, coherent, one-voice EU actor, because every member state wants to keep Washington's relations to itself. So in the end, I think U.S. policymakers realize in the end it depends on member states, and they will work that angle. So it's a curious phenomenon. It's perhaps the most dense relationship anybody really has, but its reputation in this term is a technocratic exercise. It's an overabundance of process, disproportionate to outcomes. It produces laundry lists of deliverables that fail to fire a public or political imagination. It often degenerates into a grab bag of issues that are dealt with in fairly ad hoc fashion with little sense of urgency. It cuts across all of the agencies in ways that many agencies don't even know why they're dealing with the European Union. And so it is, in Secretary Clinton's words, quote, a system designed so we can't have a strategic dialogue. She said that as she was Secretary of State. So the priorities are often mismatched in this relationship, with the U.S. seeking basically, usually, efficiencies and concrete outcomes, and the EU seeking legitimacy and a U.S. validation of the ongoing process of EU integration. So that is a huge mismatch from the beginning. And the real kicker here of all of this is that actually there is no U.S.-EU strategic partnership. It doesn't exist. There is no term, there's no mechanism, there's no document. There isn't one. So we can describe it in a general term and say there are 10 EU strategic partnerships, but there is not a strategic partnership agreement. The framework for the U.S.-EU relationship was created in 1995, called the New Transatlantic Agenda. It has 4 chapters on economics, political, global, and human people-to-people bonds. I helped write it. I was very engaged in it. And it has never been updated since, and is basically atrophied as a real meaningful framework for the relationship. People just do their job every day, and because of this dense nature of the relationship, as others were saying, it's what really happens, not what you call it. And there's been, despite, I think, particularly on the EU side, efforts to try to create some formal updating of this, very little interest in the U.S. To do that. So I would argue that it's try to recreate a strategic partnership agreement, be attuned better to what the relationship really is, which is a very, very dense network of people who work every day in their particular area to advance U.S.-European relations, and not to create an artificial framework, but to sort of cannibalize the existing one and use the best parts of it to think more of network-based diplomacy rather than hierarchical, state-to-state diplomacy. Because the EU is more a network anyway than a state, and the U.S. works well with networks. And these networks reach far beyond the public sector into private sector, which you could argue really carries the relationship anyway. So do these strategic partnerships matter? I think from an academic perspective, the term is used in so many different ways, it's tempting to declare it essentially meaningless. But I think, because I think if you look at it harder in a broader global context, a declaration of strategic partnership doesn't, in and of itself, make a partnership strategic. Many of these are neither partnerships nor are they strategic that either of us have around the world. Many of them just talk shops. It's a way to have a way to talk together. And some of the most effective strategic partnerships, I would argue, are not classified as such. And so, again, you can sort of say, well, why do all this? I just say there's a difference between an academic debate and trying to make this neat conceptually and a diplomat's handiwork, which is to have something that's flexible practically. And I think that's the distinction. It's not neat conceptually, but it can be handy practically when you have to engage another government or your own government and harness the potential of that government and the kind of world we have of disaggregated power. So partnership, I think, like beauty, is in the eyes of the beholder. In the end, that is more what it's about than trying to get too overwrought on specific instruments and terminologies. Thank you.
I just want to make 3 points. The first, and I think Daniel made it clear in his presentation, strategic partnership does not have a precise meaning. If you Google the term and you add Canada to it, you'll find that most government departments in Canada have a strategic partnership program of some sort. And I think it goes to show that it's a word that's become fashionable, as you showed, over the past 15 years, not only with regards to foreign policy. In the framework of the European Union, it describes pretty well what the EU has always done, which Stéphane Keukeler, Ruba Al-Fattal's dissertation advisor, has called a structural foreign policy. What this means is that the EU has a very institutionalized way of understanding foreign policy. May have something to do with the fact that a lot of the EU fonctionnaires are lawyers, and so they have a very legal understanding of the world. When the French want to do something in foreign policy, they usually organize a summit. When the US president wants to do something, he invites someone to the White House. Not so sure about Canada, but different countries have, or Germany would write checks. Different countries have different understandings of foreign policy, and the EU has a very institutionalized understanding. And this way of structuring relations around a document, around the structure, the strategic partnership, I think is a good way to describe it. The big challenge when you work this way is to decide where you stand on the deepening versus widening question. And I think we've alluded to it all morning. Do you want to have a really, really close strategic partnership with a few countries you really care about, or do you want to have strategic partnerships with pretty much everybody? Do you have partnerships with your friends, with people you're interdependent with, or with big states? I mean, that is not clear when one looks at the EU's strategic partnership policy, if we may call it that. The question I would have, and I think I'll ask that question to David. In the past, the EU used to have the same attitude, but it called it inter-regionalism. You know, there was this understanding that the EU would structure its relations not with other states, but with other regions. Why have they shifted? Why is it now an EU to state relation that we're looking at? My second point is about specific challenges for the transatlantic area. Clearly, as Daniel has shown, the relationship with the US, but also with Canada, is not one of widening, but one of deepening, because the relationship is already quite strong. But here it seems to me that you have two specific challenges. The first one is the fact that whereas most EU partnerships with other countries or other organizations are deeply asymmetrical, that is with developing nations most of the time, with the US and Canada, it's a symmetric interdependence. That explains some of the things that David explained. For example, why does Canada object to having to to sign a clause on human rights or WMDs? Well, because Canada is well positioned to say we don't care about that. We don't want to be treated like some sort of a minor partner. In the case of the US, it's even clearer that the EU will not get what it wants when it negotiates with the US, if only because the US has more power than the EU. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed. There's a fundamental difference between these strategic partnerships and some of the other partnerships that we will study today in this workshop. The second point is that the economic relationship between North America and Europe is so dense and so strong, and the military relationship is also so strong, but through NATO and not through US or EU-Canada bilateral relations, that the economy is bound to dominate security issues. The same goes for Japan, which we talked about earlier today. I found a quote from Herman van Rompuy. I don't know if it's a true one. I will have to check. But apparently he said, well, that's great. Now we have all these strategic partnerships. Now we need a strategy. And that's, of course, Thomas Renard, who works with Sven Biskop, and that's been his big thing for many years now. One of the reasons why the EU doesn't have a strategy in the way we would understand strategy is because it does not have a lot of military power and is not involved in these big issues so much. So in the case of Japan, we heard today that the EU was really the demandeur on the strategic partnership agreement. I suspect it's the same with Canada. And the reason is that they want to talk security, but Canada doesn't necessarily want to talk about security in the same way that the EU wants. So I think, again, that's a specific challenge. My question here is for Daniel, just for the sake of asking pointed questions. Nobody mentioned the West. I mean, between the EU and the US and Canada, we may think that we're very different, but the rest of the world thinks we're all the same. If you ask the Islamic State organization, they don't really see a difference between Europe and the US. So how does that fit? I mean, the whole project of creating an Atlantic community or a Western community, does it fit into the equation, especially if we add in TTIP, which we really haven't talked much about, and CETA? I mean, all of this together could provide the basis for a much more ambitious, let's call it, community. So does it make sense, or is it just an illusion? My third point, well, since I'm Canadian, I'll talk a bit more about Canada. The strategic partnership with Canada, by definition, for the EU is a low-pain but also low-gain business. There's just not that many problems to deal with, but the advantages are not that clear either. In the case of Canada, I would say that the disciplinary mechanism is not that important that you talked about. I mean, with Russia, it makes sense. With other regions, with Canada, I don't see that there's a lot of disagreement among EU member states. One thing that makes these partnership agreements very important, and I was really interested to hear the presentation about Japan this morning, is that it's a wonderful way to keep your elected officials engaged. Because one thing that the EU is not very good at is having personal relations, having figureheads or individuals that everybody wants to talk to and wants to invite over for dinner as representatives of something important. When you have something like a strategic partnership, what this means is that you have set meetings. You can actually tell your prime minister, you have to go to that meeting. It's going to be very important for you. And you do it at all levels, not only at the level of heads of government. And it can be really interesting also from the Canadian perspective, because when, and I don't mean that as any form of disrespect, but when Slovenia had the presidency of the EU, maybe the Canadian prime minister was not that interested in having an EU-Canada summit. When Germany had the presidency, it became a lot more interesting for the Canadian Prime Minister. It became an opportunity to have that high-level interaction. So I think this is something when we think about strategic partnerships, yes, it may not do a lot, and I think this is what you were referring to, but actually it puts a name and it structures a very, very dense relationship that's at the political level, but also at the bureaucratic level. On that point, maybe Manfred and Greg, and that will be my question. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about what's in that document that nobody's read yet, because we're not impolite enough to check our iPhones during the workshop. So if you could enlighten us, that would be very interesting. What is the main highlight of that strategic partnership? The one thing we should bring home. I'll just finish by making a small promotion comment. On Saturday, I just sent Joan a policy paper that I had been supposed to write for 18 months at least for the Transatlantic dialogue, and it's about fighter jet procurement in Canada and what we can learn from the EU. I find it very interesting that in Canada, we never even considered buying European fighter jets. It was clear from the start that we would buy an American one. And I think it makes a lot of sense for all kinds of reasons that we would want to buy an American fighter jets, and a lot of European countries did exactly the same. But I think that if you want to have a strategic partnership, if you really want to call it strategic, you would have to at least consider considering European options in your defense industry sector. I think this is where we could say, okay, the strategic partnership is not only about having discussions, it's really also considering the other part as someone you do security with, and that goes both ways. So I'll end here and maybe turn to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. I think we'll do what we did this morning, and that's hold off the responses to Professor Mérand's points and see if there's any questions. Anybody have any questions? I thought we would take a couple. No? Okay. Well, while you're gathering your thoughts and your questions, then we'll go to our responses. Professor Long.
I'm in the what feels like an odd situation, because I feel like I'm the least skeptical of the Canada-EU strategic partnership, which wasn't what I meant to have happen. Not that I wanted it to be hard ass. Let me specifically answer Frédéric's comment, because I think it's a really one of the things I wanted to say was the overall conference. I think is actually the design of it is great, and I really appreciated the first session. I'm not an expert on EU-Japan or EU-China, but the resonance of certain things and the contrasts are something that I'm going to be able to bring to my future work on EUCAnet, I hope. But I think one of the things that we tend to do when we study the specific relationship is we study the specific relationship and then occasionally stick in these extra things. Let me suggest that one of the things we really need to do is say, not only is it a term of art and how does it work, but what does it mean to talk about a strategic partnership? What's it an instance of? What is the Canada-EU or Canada-China or EU-China or EU-Japan? What are these instances of? And let me suggest to you, it's pretty obvious what they are. They're instances of bilateral relations. Bilateral relations which we don't study enough in terms of systematically trying to understand them. I could say a number of things about that, but the specific thing with regard to the EU, and Daniel mentioned it, the EU is not a usual bilateral partner. It's an unusual international actor. As such, while we're looking at all of these relationships and doing the comparisons, we're comparing on a set of relationships which, when we look at the relationships, we can do the comparisons and they look like there's a certain normalcy, we can complain about them. But actually, in fact, relations with the EU, Canada doesn't have such intense relationships with a non-state, for the most part. And so this is important to think about. This then comes to why is the EU moving to apparently away from interregion? I don't know, I would admit, but here's a couple of suggestions. One, the EU is not a coherent international actor, but arguably it's a lot more coherent. It's got a legal identity. There's a certain sense in which there's more of a mandate. The EU is seen around the world more and more, yes, as this fractious thing, but it's the European Union. You can trace this history. It's this cohesive thing. One can do the comparison to the United States as a political system. What the heck is that? We're comparing the United States with the EU as a political system? Wow. So I think there's a sense in which the EU is moving beyond the idea of the EU as a region to region because it's more of a cohesive actor. That's number one. Again, context. One needs to think about context. I intimated I have a lot more to say. Too little time. The nature of international relations right now, the world system as it is. The significance of the BRICS, the importance of the G20, the nature of the international system, which I would suggest not only on the World Trade Organization, where there's a certain fractiousness, but on things like the AIIB, the Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? There's a breaking up of multilateralism and a growth, I've suggested, of multiple bilateralisms. To me, that's what's going on with the EU. The EU is, I mean, when we look at those states that are in, right, what would be remarkable is to kind of think about how the EU is structuring its relationships with members of the G20, say. And so I think that there's something going on here. In terms of the US, I think one of the interesting things, again, I tried to hint at, framework agreement in '76 happens absent the United States, right? Both the Transatlantic Declaration and the Joint Action Plan and Joint Political Declaration, which was delayed by Fish, happened at more or less the same time. Ours, the delay by Fish, was a year later. What we've got today is Canada's agreement on CETA preceding the American agreement, if there is one. The question is, does that matter? Is it going to make a difference?
Thanks very much. Professor Hamilton.
Well, in fact, on that, just the historical, if you want to mention that. So I think until the end of the Cold War, the U.S. view of the European Commission and the European community, if it was a bit ambivalent, it was seen mainly in economic terms, and the Nixon, Ford administrations weren't about to engage in this type of partnership. Richard Nixon had choice words for his view of what the EU was at the time. But I think another Republican administration, though, at the end of the Cold War, decided that in the context of unification of Germany, the end of the Iron Curtain and all of that, that the EU, the European community at the time, was going to become, in fact, a major partner, and that all of the institutions of Europe, the NATO, EU, if you will, and CSCE had to be revamped. And in fact, that's what both the Bush and Clinton administration did in the immediate aftermath, was reframe all of those. And so that is why there was an alignment, I think, at that time. It was bipartisan, in fact, and why that is now what we have. I would just make one slight footnote also, just to indicate, a number of EU member states have their own strategic partnerships. Again, this shows the dilemma. EU is speaking for the EU, but then you have Germany has some, the UK has some, others have some. What is it? So I think it's hard to make sense of this. My point is it's a diplomatic tool that is used by specific diplomatic services to do certain things, some of them as much for internal reasons as external reasons. And I think your basic point was about the West, if you will. I would say the way I would think about this, and I think how I think diplomats are thinking about it, or political leaders, is how do you utilize the full spectrum of your power resources to leverage your interests, advance those interests? So soft power to hard power, the full spectrum. And how can you utilize all the instruments at your disposal, the full toolbox, if you will? You want to give yourself as many instruments and options as possible, which means this notion of strategic partnership is one tool, but so are the alliances, so is the military effort, so are economic agreements. And so you see both the United States and many European countries trying to use as much of the toolbox as they can to advance those issues. So strategic partnerships are one box, alliances are one box. I think the perhaps meatier box at the moment in terms of the West is in fact the series of mega regional agreements. But I would include CETA as part of that. But it's the TPP, it's the TTIP, and if you see it from the United States point of view, of course, the only country that's party to both of those, and using and leveraging its own position to advance this American system, if you will. And so if you think about it in that way, you see that a trade agreement across the Atlantic between the United States and the EU is not just about opening up the transatlantic market. It's really equally as much, if not more, about repositioning the United States and Europe for the world we are facing, not the one we left behind. It is as much about that repositioning for a world of diffuse power as it is about chickens and about GMOs. And I think what has been missing in the debate on TTIP is this geopolitical piece. So, and that's where the West comes in, which is the question our president said, who writes the rules? It's kind of a basic question. And I think that is really what we're engaged in today. So if you had to ask me, what's the geopolitical side of the TTIP and how do you harness these resources? The TTIP is important, I'm not talking about the economics now, but it's important to the transatlantic community itself, just as CETA is important to the transatlantic community itself. It reaffirms that community. It locks in our mutual relationship in a bigger world in which our piece of that world is shrinking. It affirms basic principles that we believe in, and that's why you do the human rights and other things, not because we're using it to beat up on each other, because we want to make sure that those principles are still there, and we maintain standards at this level and not this level. And so whatever you can do to mutually reaffirm that is important. In the context of Europe today, many worried about a pivot to Asia by the United States and maybe the U.S. not paying as much attention. The U.S. security guarantee to Europe is immeasurably enhanced if the U.S. is prepared to lock in its economy
to that of Europe as well.